morning, everyone. Welcome to CityWise, breakfast with the Toulan School. I'm Connie Azawa. I'm the director of the Toulan School for the next 6 days. And then my successor will be Dr. Jennifer Dill. So just a little public announcement there. Thank you for coming this morning. As many of you know, the CityWise series was begun 5 years ago now as a means for the faculty at the Toulan School to share with you, our community, the research that we've been doing, and to ensure, as a way of ensuring that the work that we do is relevant to the lives of our community, that it's right, that we're asking the right questions, that we're seeking the right sorts of data and that kind of thing. So we really rely on you all and your attendance to these sessions to help us to think better about the work that we're doing. So thank you all for coming. Before we get started with today's session, I want to just make a couple of announcements. First, I want to acknowledge, though, Arlene Brothel, who's been working above and beyond kind of her job description to step in as we've been kind of short-staffed in the Toulan School. So you may not have received emails from her, but she's been kind of carrying on everything behind the scenes here. So I want to thank Arlene for all the work you've done. Arlene, thank you. And then I just want to let you all know that the next CityWise session is going to be on November 4th. So we're breaking with tradition. Usually we have our sessions on the second Wednesdays of the month, every other month. But November 11th is Veterans Day, so we're holding the session a week earlier on the 4th, so you can mark your calendars. You'll get an announcement if you've been on our listserv, so if you haven't, you should sign up with Arlene so that you get the announcements as they come out. On November 4th, our faculty member, Dr. Vivek Shandas, will talk about the research that he's been doing. You might have seen him on the news recently talking about urban heat islands in the city of Portland, but he'll do a kind of a combination of much of the environmental planning work that he's been doing. So mark your calendars, 7:30 on November 4th. Okay, so I think that's it. I might have forgotten something. We'll have to catch up later. But now I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Ethan Seltzer, who many of you know has been on our faculty at Portland State for more than 20 years, probably about 22, so that's my guess. But, and he's been a leader in the field in urban planning, regional planning in this region and nationally and internationally. So I'm very pleased to turn the floor over now to Ethan and let him introduce the rest of the session. Thank you.
There we go. Yeah. I was all prepared to bellow. Oh well. So thank you, Connie, and welcome everybody. Good morning. My name is Ethan Seltzer, and I am a professor in the Toulan School. And what we're going to talk about today is a project that a large number of us in the Pacific Northwest were involved in over the last couple of years, and which resulted in this book, Planning the Pacific Northwest, and that's what we're going to talk about today. In fact, we're going to be giving some of these books away, so listen carefully for the trivia questions during the course of this presentation, and you may walk away with a pristine copy, still in its cellophane. So I don't even know if it's cellophane. I don't know, some kind of plastic. All right. The idea for this book really kind of grew out of a couple of different things. There was a meeting of American Institute of Certified Planning Fellows up in Seattle, Oregon, and Washington Fellows back in 2010, talking about things that could be done in common. There was a joint conference in 2011, Oregon and Washington chapters. We began to do kind of more things together, but the key moment, Connie reminded me of this, was a taxi ride that she took in 2014, I think, after the Chicago conference of the American Planning Association with a woman named Jill Sterrett, who is a planning consultant up in Seattle and who really was the spark plug for this project. And the conversation was about the fact that in 2015, actually just earlier this year, the American Planning Association was coming to Seattle and was going to hold this conference in Seattle. And wouldn't it be great if we could do some kind of book about planning in the Pacific Northwest? Because this is a pretty, we believe, amazing place, right? We're all here by choice for the most part. We also think it's kind of an interesting planning culture and a lot of interesting things going on in both public and private sectors around planning and community development. And it'd be great to kind of portray that for the people coming to this conference. Similar books have been done for Atlanta, for Los Angeles, and for Chicago. And so contact was made with Planners Press, and they agreed to publish a book on planning in essentially Cascadia, if we could pull it together. So actually, I look back at this. There must be, our story is a little twisted, but that's okay, because it's really not that important. But what happened to kind of kick this all off was that in June of 2013, actually, we issued a request for abstracts to potential authors. And in fact, there was a really great first line in that request for abstracts from authors, which was kind of something along the lines of, would you like to be a published author? Right? Well, I mean, who wouldn't want to be a published author, right? Absolutely. So we sent out the RFP to get kind of proposals for books. We had organized the proposal for the book around 3 kind of key sections. One, dealing with the history of planning in the Pacific Northwest. And when we say Pacific Northwest, we're really talking Cascadia, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon. We didn't really delve into Idaho. We didn't get into Montana. There's a lot of different definitions of the Pacific Northwest, but we were pretty much sticking with the I-5 corridor in the upper left edge here. So the first section dealt with the history. Second section dealt with kind of the green theme, the idea that within this territory there's a lot of attention paid to issues of the environment, the fit between what people do and what the environment can accept. A lot of issues along those lines. And then the third section about the future. Where were we going? What were the key challenges? What might kind of emerge as themes in the future? So we got a whole bunch of abstracts back. We sorted them, we edited them, we diced and chopped them. And as a matter of fact, in this audience today are a number of the authors who contributed. The 40 authors are groups of people, ultimately, who contributed sections to this book. Patty Tillett is here, Marie Wolkowitz is here, there's a whole bunch of people here. In fact, anyone who contributed, Charles Hying, I should mention, and I just have. So so everybody who contributed to this book could just kind of raise your hands. You can see them around the room, Jeff Litwack, others. We had a big group who contributed to making this book possible. Now, when we started this book, we started with a fundamental question that we were hoping we would answer. We had no idea whether we could answer it or whether it was a question that anyone could answer, but we were interested in this question of, is planning in Cascadia unique in some way? Can we assert that there's something unusual or special about what happens with respect to planning? Is there a planning culture in Cascadia that sets it apart from other places? Do we do things in a different way? That's a really, really hard question to answer, it turns out, because without kind of knowing about planning everywhere, it's kind of hard to assert that, what you've got is unique, right? But what we thought was that by turning this over to the 40-some groups of authors or individuals, that we would get a collection of articles that would help give us some kind of a sense, right, about what planning in the Pacific Northwest was, that we could present it in some way and that the readers could compare it to wherever they came from and make the most of what we had provided. This is not a comprehensive book in that we don't have tales of every single kind of planning adventure ever contemplated or engaged in the states of Oregon, Washington, and the province of British Columbia. These are 40 articles that we believe, 40 chapters begin to kind of give that sense of what planning in this territory is all about. And so we put it together. We asked authors to address, what was unique, what was unusual, what set planning in this region apart. And as I mentioned, that turned out to be a really, really tough question to answer. Nonetheless, of course, we would try to kind of draw some conclusions about this. There are some common themes that came up. And I think if you read this book, particularly the lucky winners, in fact, I think it's, no, we'll wait on that. Especially the lucky winners of these copies will notice that there are a number of common themes. First of all, we do plan in this region. I mean, we actually plan a lot, and we plan all kinds of stuff. We're engaged in trying to kind of think about the future and what we're going to make of it in a lot of different ways for a lot of different purposes. I mean, the breadth of activity here is pretty striking. And not only that, but not only do we plan today, but we've been actually planning for some time. There's a chapter in here about the Olmsted brothers, who did a lot of work in Portland and Seattle and Vancouver and Victoria, back at the turn of the 20th century. They probably invented boilerplate, for those of you familiar with that term, we've been at it ever since. In some ways, you could probably say that Lewis and Clark walking across the continent was part of a planning adventure. Certainly, the development of hydropower in the Columbia River watershed, also talked about here, part of a massive planning adventure. And then, in more contemporary times, the idea of Senate Bill 100 and the Washington Growth Management Act, and the metropolitan planning in Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, BC, all of which have established a reputation for planning as basically part of not just a planning culture here, but the civic culture of this region. Second of all, landscape matters here. I mean, I think you'll notice when you read through this collection, and I hope you all do, and by the way, if you don't win one of these lucky copies, we're terribly sorry about that, but you can get the book on Amazon, so. Also APA Press, right? There's all kinds of ways you can get it. But in any event, landscape matters. We do things with reference to the landscape, to the environment, to the land and water of Cascadia a lot, and you'll notice it in these articles. Third, we participate. And this is kind of interesting. This would actually be kind of a fun thing to follow up on a little bit more. And for those of you who've worked in other parts of the country, not only do we participate, there's an expectation that we will participate. Now, I don't know, maybe it's, more or less than it used to be or more or less than in other places, but participation is a theme. This has many flavors of that as you take a look through it. But finally, the other theme I think that comes through in this is that we expect planning to make change. We're not doing this to create plans. We're doing this to solve problems. And I think that comes through in chapter after chapter, that the planning in the Pacific Northwest and Cascadia is about addressing the issues of this region. It's not just about addressing the needs of planners to plan, right? Thank goodness for that. So I'm going to stop now, and I'm going to turn to two of our authors who participated in this, two of my colleagues and Connie's colleagues, Cy Adler, who is the Associate Dean for the College of Urban and Public Affairs, he will also introduce himself a little bit more, I'm sure, and also a professor in the School of Urban Studies and Planning. And Sheila Martin, who's the director of the Institute of Portland Metropolitan Studies, located within the College of Urban and Public Affairs, both of whom contributed to this book. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cy, and we can work our way down the table. Okay. And then we'll come back to you for questions, and of course, fabulous prizes. Okay.
So how's this one doing? Okay. Good morning. As Ethan said, I'm Associate Dean, College of Urban and Public Affairs, Professor of Urban Studies and Planning. It's year 34 for me at Portland State. And my chapter in this book is mostly about the 1970s. And it's about the original urban growth boundary around the Portland metropolitan area. So I've been living in the 1970s for many, many years now, researching and writing about Senate Bill 100 and its early implementation. And so then I decided to segue from Senate Bill 100 and a state-level focus to the Portland metropolitan area and this urban growth boundary, which we know is iconic. People come from around the world to study it. My sense is that the adoption of an urban growth boundary for the Portland metropolitan area by Metro was the most important thing that Metro did, and that acknowledging the urban growth boundary, that's something that the State Land Conservation and Development Commission did, was the most important thing LCDC has done, and that having an urban growth boundary in the Portland metropolitan area was also a singular moment in the history of land use planning in the United States. So it's an interesting thing. It's a really interesting thing. It shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody that planning for an urban growth boundary around the metropolitan area, getting it adopted, getting it acknowledged by the state, was a pretty contentious process. It wasn't easy, it wasn't simple. It took a lot longer than it was, quote, supposed to take. And an awful lot of things happened along the way, and of course continue to happen as a result of putting the thing in place 30 plus years ago. So a few key points about this urban growth boundary stuff. One, on the notion of uniqueness. I think it really was unique in the United States. The planning that was done in Oregon and in the Portland metropolitan region during the 1970s was unique, and the people doing it here were aware of that. We all know about Senate Bill 100, 1973. A companion bill during that legislative session isn't as well known, but is in some ways even more interesting than Senate Bill 100. And that was Senate Bill 769 that created a regional planning district in the Portland metropolitan area. This was also 1973. And it transformed a council of governments, the Columbia Region Association of Governments, into what was clearly the most comprehensive and authoritative regional planning agency in the United States at the time. It had authorities that simply weren't available to regional entities elsewhere in the United States. And when CRAG searched for its first executive director, people were aware we are doing something that isn't happening anywhere else in the United States, and that people will be watching us. And that Portland was embarked on a journey that, again, was something that wasn't happening nearly to the same extent elsewhere in the United States. So, but CRAG and Senate Bill 769 have to be seen in context with Senate Bill 100 and the statewide planning program. The two really need to go together in order to understand the urban growth boundary and the process of planning and then implementing it. And it's also very important to keep in mind that the federal government was very active promoting regional planning during this period as well. And the very first manifestation of an urban growth boundary in the Portland metropolitan area came as a result of a federal government mandate. As part of planning mandates in which the federal government said, if you want to spend federal government money on water, on sewer, on transportation projects, on open space acquisition, you must have a regional plan. And so the Columbia Region Association of Governments was the agency in the Portland metropolitan area that was the certified regional planning entity. And so it was a focal point for the cities and the counties in the region to struggle with one another, and it was a struggle to reach agreements on plan elements in order to qualify for federal funding. That's an important part of the background, and again, the urban growth boundary is one manifestation of CRAG's response to federal mandates. So Ethan mentioned environment, and again, as I read through all the plans and documents and debates that were taking place at the time, a notion that was current then, and it's morphed, but of course is still with us, carrying capacity. That there's a limit. And people were persuaded we can define limits to growth with regard to air quality, water quality, certain aspects of land health. A little more complicated to think about it in population terms, but they tried. It's one of the things that many planners struggled with, is to define a carrying capacity for the region, and it reflected something that was happening statewide as well, because we almost had, among the first set of 14 statewide planning goals in Oregon, a carrying capacity goal. It fell off the table at the very last moment, in part because many planners were saying, we don't know how to implement such a goal quite yet. The science isn't quite there. But nevertheless, it was interesting to see people struggle with trying to define a carrying capacity for the region as a way of thinking about what ought to be an urban growth boundary. And because Senate Bill 769, creating a regional planning district in the Portland metropolitan area, passed at the same time that Senate Bill 100, carried forth this mandate that every city and county in the state of Oregon do a comprehensive land use plan and adopt zoning and other land use regulations to implement that plan in compliance with statewide planning goals, one of which was to draw an urban growth boundary. It became a very, very complex planning environment. There was a state mandate to plan, there's a regional mandate to plan, and I'll say a few more words about the complexity, but again, it's interesting to try to appreciate the very complex planning environment that emerged in Oregon and in the region during the 1970s. And again, something that was unique in the United States at the time, that there were both state and regional mandates and state goals that were legally binding, and CRAG, the new CRAG, was told to adopt region-specific goals and objectives and to develop a comprehensive regional plan, and all the plans done by the cities and counties in the Portland metropolitan area would have to be consistent with what CRAG was doing, its goals and objectives, its regional plan, and also the cities and counties had to do plans that would be reviewed by, approved by the state. Again, very, very complex situation. So imagine a few dozen cities and counties beginning to do plans, the regional agency having to do plans, the regional agency facing federal mandates and state mandates. Very, very complicated situation. Lots of money flowing into the region from the federal government worrying, are you spending our money wisely? That sort of thing. All right, so a few bigger picture points. Very early on, the first regional plan, including an urban growth boundary, adopted by CRAG, Columbia Region Association of Governments, was called at the time Trend City. It was a composite plan. What that meant was the CRAG planners patched together existing plans that had been done by city and county governments and called it the regional plan. Trend City in that it was based on the trends that had been occurring since World War II, a kind of low-density, sprawling pattern of development that was urbanizing a lot of farmland and encroaching on sensitive natural areas. So all of those assumptions about the kinds of housing units that would be built, density out there, all of that was built into the composite plan that was adopted at the time. Trend City. The story of the 1970s will be a series of efforts by regional planners to transcend Trend City. So to come up with a regional plan, a plan with a regional perspective. So you see the dynamic. It wasn't a surprise to anybody that in the context of all these local governments with their own individual plans, it would be a challenge to craft a plan that would put forward a regional perspective, something that would be different than simply patching together the local government plans that had already been done and would be done pursuant to Senate Bill 100 requirements. A carrying capacity was an element in that process. But that's going to be the story of the 1970s, as a continuing series of efforts to get beyond simply putting together what the individual city and county governments do, to adopt region-specific goals and objectives, and a plan that would implement those. To get past the situation, the root condition for all of this, local governments competing with one another to attract industry, to attract higher income households, to improve the local tax base. An interesting idea that was very, very important at the time, tax base sharing, something that had been adopted in the Minneapolis-St. Paul region, 1971, and the planners here were well aware of it. They, if you will, salivated over it, that if we could have tax-based sharing, it would give us a tool that would enable us to unite the many different local governments in the region around a regional plan, because everybody would share in the benefits of regional growth. Absent tax-based sharing, it looked like a much more difficult process to transcend the competition between local governments that was such an important aspect of local comprehensive planning. So again, that's what the chapter is primarily about. It's about the back and forth between efforts to craft something regional, something specific to the region, pushback from, local governments that again are constantly competing with one another and seeking a local advantage, dealing with, for example, home builders who, in many cases small, building a few single-family homes a year, didn't want to do much of anything differently, and so that influenced the way people thought about density and location within the region. So it was an interesting mix, and during the 1970s, a key element in the story becomes the role of 1,000 Friends of Oregon, which emerges in 1975 to watchdog the statewide planning program. So it's one of these interesting historical stories that the 1,000 Friends staff member who watchdogs CRAG, and he does so in an extremely vigilant manner, is Bob Stacy. Law school graduate, 1975, starts working for 1,000 Friends, and immediately, 1975, 1976, is writing memos often harshly critical of the CRAG planners' efforts, their struggle to transcend Trend City and adopt a regional plan with a fairly tight urban growth boundary that would protect as much farmland as possible, and create a model, an urban form, and I think we see manifestations of this again throughout and up until our own time, of a certain kind of metropolitan area. And it was a metropolitan form that I think was widespread throughout the industrial world. Compact, moderately dense, transit-oriented form of metropolitan development. That was the model that most regional planners had in mind, and that most local planners had in mind as the ideal urban form. If you could do it that way, again, you wouldn't have to be continually pushing out into fringe areas. And again, if you could do fairly dense, compact development around transit stations, a lot of open space could be preserved in between the transit lines. It was a model of regional growth that was widespread in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, and elsewhere during this period. It was the model that regional planners, as well as Bob Stacy and 1,000 Friends, had in mind for this region. And the planning process was a struggle to get some regional consensus on the value of that approach, and then allocate resources, put in place regulations that would move in that direction. So, be pleased to answer any more detailed questions later.
Good morning. As Ethan mentioned, I'm Sheila Martin, Director of the Institute of Portland Metropolitan. Oh, have to be close. I just recently heard about how women's voices are much more difficult to hear than men's voices. So all those women who tell their husbands, "You're not listening to me," they actually sometimes can't hear them because they're more difficult to hear.
And that too.
And that too. But it is intimidating to follow Cy. But one of the things that Ethan didn't say is that one of the things that I do is I'm also the director of the Population Research Center, and we do demographic research about Oregon and Portland. And so my chapter in the book talks about how the population changes as you move from Portland to Seattle to Vancouver and in eastern Washington and Oregon. But that's not what I'm going to talk about, although you should read it.
And some of you will get a chance to.
Well, what I'm going to talk about is a little bit more about what I learned from reading the book, because I have a lot more to learn from reading the book than I have to share with you about what I already knew before I read the book. So as I was reading through the book, one of the things that struck me was that, and in thinking about how the Pacific Northwest might be different from other places, what struck me was the tensions that are brought out in a lot of the chapters that exist in our planning system. So I wanted to talk a little bit about those tensions and how they might play out differently in other places that are different from the Pacific Northwest. So there's a lot of these tensions in our planning system, right? And in one of the chapters, Mike Hauk and his co-author talk about open space. So, in particular, how because we desire this compact urban form, the tension between making sure that we're not sprawling out and making sure that we have enough open space that people are willing to accept the density that's required in order to prevent that sprawl, and yet still give them the open space, the connection to nature that they need to feel like they don't need a house in the suburbs. And so that's a real tension, because creating space for that open space within the city necessarily means that we can't put, a few hundred people on those few acres of park that might be in that neighborhood otherwise. So I wonder if that tension plays out differently in the industrial Midwest or the post-industrial Midwest and other places where what they're struggling with isn't so much, can we fit all the people in here, but what are we going to do with the space that's left over since the people left? And their concerns are really more about finding the money that they need to make that conversion happen than this tension between open space within the urban growth boundary and preserving the space outside the urban growth boundary. So that's one of the tensions that I think maybe is different here in the Pacific Northwest than other places. And it's a similar story, I think, when we talk about food systems planning. So, the sort of hysteria around our food culture in both Portland and Seattle and in Vancouver sort of converted into this real appreciation for local agriculture and small farms, and the idea that we can, eat food that's grown close to us. And so the need to create space, there's a lot of interest in urban farming, but creating space for urban farming, again, means, well, that's space that we would use for people who otherwise might have to live on farmland. So then there's this tension between, urban agriculture that's closer to people so that they can interact with their food system, and agriculture at a scale that maybe could be more profitable than what's possible within the urban growth boundary. So I wonder if places where farmland isn't as valuable or productive or as based on small farms as in the Willamette Valley and in the Skagit Valley and in the Vancouver area, if we're talking about farmland that's monoculture agriculture, they might not have as much at stake, so that tension might not be as close to the surface with respect to finding the land that we want in order to keep people close to their food versus preserving the land that we need in order to ensure that we still have profitable agriculture that's not monoculture corporate farming. So that's another one of the another one of the tensions that I noticed. And then a third one that's discussed in the book is this tension between the need for meaningful community involvement and the idea that professional planners really want to exert what they know and make sure that the right decisions are made. So how interested are we in really letting citizens dictate or direct or shape the planning decisions that are made when actually, what professional planners want to do is create the urban form that they believe is the right urban form. And I have to wonder whether that tension exists as much in other places where people maybe aren't paying as much attention or maybe aren't as, planning savvy as many of us are, or, just the common citizens, people who show up to meetings. And yet the professional planners are, scared of, or not scared of, but not interested maybe always in listening to the NIMBYism that comes out in some of these meetings. So that tension between meaningful engagement of citizens and sort of making sure that good planning practice is implemented. Does that play out the same in other places as it does in the Pacific Northwest? So that's the third tension that I noticed, and there's a lot more of them in the book. But the one I want to talk about a little bit more is maybe not so much a tension as a disconnect, and that's between our land use and transportation planning and the planning that we do around economic development. And maybe that's because I know a little bit more about that piece of planning than some of the other folks on the panel do. But what I see is a big disconnect, and there's really in several different ways. One of them is institutional. So we have transportation and land use planning institutions. On the Oregon side, we have Metro, and it doesn't formally extend across the Columbia River into Vancouver, and yet our economy, our labor market, our housing market, our economy does. And so how can we align our transportation and land use planning structures with our economic development planning structures when the institutions aren't, I think they try to cooperate, but they're not formally aligned. Now, I know that with respect to the Puget Sound Regional Council, all of those functions are in regional economic development planning is in the same institution that the transportation and land use planning piece is embedded. And so I wonder if the alignment there is better, whether the planning is more in sync. I think the second part of that disconnect, aside from institutional, is sort of a time frame. So we're planning for a 20-year land supply, but the economic development plan that's currently being developed by Greater Portland, Inc. is a 5-year economic development planning horizon. So, maybe that's by necessity. Maybe it's too hard to see what the future of our economy might be, but can we do a better job of thinking long-term about what our economy might look like, and how does that tie to the land supply needs and the transportation needs and the housing needs that we have going out into the future? In fact, how can we really do a good job of planning for that 20-year land supply when we don't have a good vision of what the economy might be? So, maybe that's not really all that different than other places. I don't know. It would be an interesting question. Then I think there's also this disconnect between our intentionality in planning, in land use and transportation planning, to really cultivate pluralism in the voices that come to the table and give us their opinions about what they think the future of this place should be. And I think that may be very different from the sort of closed, specific pro-growth networks that come to the table around economic development. And while there are, other networks that are involved in economic development, promoting small business development and things like that, I'm not sure that the networks and the, sort of pro-growth folks that typically direct our economic development policies and plans are connected to the networks that are really working in the trenches to promote economic development from the bottom up. So I see that as another sort of disconnect or tension in our economic development planning. So, whether that's different between the Pacific Northwest and other places, I'm not really sure. It may be that the pluralism, the pluralist voices that we try to bring to the planning table are absent in lots of economic development conversations around the country. But that's, I think, something that would be interesting to explore.
Say something? Yeah.
All right. Hello again. One of the advantages of going after my two colleagues here is that they've said very eloquently many of the same ideas that I've had, and so I don't need to repeat them. And that's what I will do. But I just want to underscore that I agree with Ethan that landscape and place is very significant in this region. And Seattle's beautiful with Rainier kind of towering over it in the background. We always look to Mount Hood to see how clearly we can see it and how the glaciers are doing. British Columbia is a beautiful landscape as well. And I think that this is distinctive. I've lived in many ostentatiously beautiful places. You know, I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I lived in Honolulu, and then in more quiet, in areas that exude a more quiet beauty, like Boston, the foothills of the Appalachians, and southeastern Ohio. But I think that here, and we really pay attention to our landscape, and we really value it. And I was just musing this morning that, you know, in Waikiki, sea turtles off the beach are valued more for the excitement that they ignite in tourists than in the sense of awe that they can survive all the surfers out there, right? It's like, it's just not, we just don't have that same attitude or they don't have the same attitude in Hawaii. I didn't feel it when I lived there as we do here when we think about salmon. And even the way that we prefer to eat wild salmon over farmed salmon. But there is, you know, the iconic, you know, salmon on the side of South Park restaurant, that kind of thing, that I think is very salient in this region. And it is distinctive, and it may not be unique, but it is distinctive. And I think it's something that we ought to pay attention to. And then, like Cy, I agree that it's institutions, that our history of having growth management in Washington State and, you know, a longer history of state land use law in Oregon has been very significant, not just for the laws or the rules that it imposes, but basically because it has created a framework and a structure for us to kind of funnel our energies around public decision making. And I think that institutionalization has kept alive some great ideas that people had 35 years ago. And then finally, Sheila had mentioned the idea of civic engagement, and so had Ethan actually, but this idea that we involve the public, that, you know, that we care a lot about creating voices, creating channels for many voices to enter the discussion. So I think all those things are very true, and those are the first 3 points that I had. The fourth point, which no one has mentioned yet, is that I think that it's a little bit ironic that in the context of very structured institutional planning frameworks in the Pacific Northwest, we actually have this reputation of being very laid back on the West Coast, right? I mean, I know that you all have probably heard that from your visitors from the East Coast. They come to Portland, they come to Seattle, they love it because it's so laid back. Well, I like to think of it, after having lived in Boston for 10 years, as being, we're just not neurotic, right? But the other piece of it, it's ironic that in this context of very regulated, almost prescriptive, some people would think, land use planning, that actually I think we're quite responsive to grassroots initiatives, that we allow for innovations to come from the bottom up, truly the bottom up. And so in this book, you'll see articles written about city repair in Portland, where, you know, they just kind of, citizens just kind of got together and kind of took over the streets early on, and now it's become an accepted part of our urban landscape. Food carts, food pods. I mean, these are not government initiatives. These are not things that were kind of prescribed and sent down, but these are things that kind of emerged. And we're not laid back, but we're maybe more tolerant. We allow for more innovation, creativity, and I think that there's also this sense of collaborativeness, that it's not, we want to make things work. We're not so fiercely competitive as some other parts of the country are or seem to be. We're not so aggressively competitive, but we actually want to make things work for others as well as ourselves. So we're not going to give up, which I think is the wrong kind of direction to go, to kind of give up our values, but we also, and our interests, but we also kind of recognize the need to coexist, that we want to kind of create a place that's good for most of us, if not all of us, and that we're willing to kind of have a little bit more tolerance and allow for, you know, a little bit more leeway. There may be things we don't really understand, but we're not going to have to we don't need to pin it down before we make a decision. We can kind of let things emerge and then react a little bit more. So anyway, so the idea of, what does this laid back in the Pacific Northwest really mean? And, in the context of very prescriptive, relatively speaking, planning regulations. So I'll now turn, very conscious that we want to actually have a conversation with all of you. I'll turn the mic back over to Ethan.
Sounds good. So if you've got a question for the panel, or let's do it this way. If you have a question for the panel, make sure it's a question. Otherwise, if you have a comment about whether we're neurotic or not, you can make that comment. Okay? How's that sound? Let's start here.
I'm Mary Vogel. I guess I would direct this question to Adler because it seems he spent the most time on the urban growth boundary. As probably most of you know, one of PSU's professors, Gerald Milner, who heads up the real estate school, got lots of publicity. It seems it was within the last year, critiquing the urban growth boundary for raising the cost of housing beyond most working class or middle class people. And he actually maintained that the urban growth boundary pushes more people out to more distant places like Newburgh and Sandy and Vancouver and beyond, up into Washington. So I'm wondering what your response to that is. A second part of that is, did Gerald Milner get a chapter in your book?
I got to give you a little bit of an historical answer. So it's interesting that many of the issues that we fight about with regard to the urban growth boundary today, they fought about back in the 1970s. The two issues that motivated a lot of the land use planning stuff that we've been into in the last 40 plus years, a threat, suburban sprawl, two, farm and forest, the two largest industry sectors in the state. At the time, certainly, they were the two biggest economic sectors. And the second one was the cost of supplying infrastructure to service sprawling patterns of development. And so the urban growth boundary was intended to deal with both of those, to enable more efficient supply of services and facilities. And that's actually been a goal, if you will, of planners going back to the origins of the field in the 19th century, is to integrate land development and infrastructure supply so as to make most efficient use of very expensive services and facilities, and again, to protect these very, very important economic sectors. So again, that's what the urban growth boundary was supposed to accomplish. So way back in the day, the home builders and others said very, very clearly, not just the home builders, what many, many people argued, when you draw a line, you will create a more scarce commodity, and as a result of reducing supply, then the price of the remaining land would increase. And it's very clear, again, at the state level and within the Portland metropolitan area, the Portland Association of Home Builders positioned itself as the champion of affordable housing. That if we do this thing, the average working class household will not be able to afford to live in the region. So again, they fought about those sorts of things. And it's also interesting that a solution, or rather a technique, to deal with that possibility emerged early on in the 1970s, and it reflected the availability of computers. Which is to say, Perhaps, right? We acknowledge that's a possibility, especially as we get 15, 20 years out. Because remember, when you do the urban growth boundary, you were thinking, as they were thinking back in the day, in 20, 25-year terms. You were creating a supply of land within the boundary that would accommodate 20, 25 years of residential and commercial industrial development. So as you got way out there, 10, 15 years down the road, well, there may very well be a price impact on the remaining supply of land. So what could we do? And the solution was, again, to use technology, interestingly enough, to monitor in real time, as much as possible, what's happening in the land market, what's happening to prices of land. And if we see developing unusually large increases in the cost of land, well, then we manage the urban growth boundary. And so it's also clear that the folks back then were thinking in growth management terms, that the UGB was supposed to be a living thing. And again, if we were concerned as a region that the cost of land is getting out of hand, well, that's a reason to change the boundary, or maybe change the way we do things inside the boundary so as to mitigate that cost impact. So again, there was an idea that was present at the time. And it also, though, I shouldn't say too much, just that there's an awful lot, again, of the fighting about the kinds of housing units. This is something that Jerry made a big point about, and the home builders make a big point about, is the balance between single-family and attached housing. Very, very same sort of discussion occurred back then. Population forecasting, hotly contested. Many different forecasts of what the regional population would be like 20, 25 years down the road. So I think a concluding point is that these are nitty-gritty planning sorts of issues, trying to see 20, 25 years down the road and saying, this is what it's going to be, and we're going to utilize that as a constraint and deal with the consequences, or manage adaptively as things change and as we have available information. Well, then we manage, we make different choices. And that's something I think that's unique in the United States, is the extent to which having this boundary and also having a growth management philosophy and approach to things, well, we get to fight about these things on a continuing basis.
And just kind of quickly, again, authors had to propose papers. We did not receive a proposal from Professor Milner. The second is that, as Simon mentioned, this is a question that's been asked over and over again, and the substantive reviews of the impact of the urban growth boundary of price since 1982, the ATIA Commission, which looked at the impact of the urban growth boundary and land use planning generally on the economy of the state of Oregon, have concluded consistently that there is probably some impact, but it's small. And third, I think it's really important to remember that the urban growth boundary is a long-term planning tool. It's not about the market over the next 18 months. It's about the land supply over the next 20 years. And so it's a very different kind of idea than a very limited kind of simple economics 101 supply and demand kind of thing. So I hope that helps. Okay. Another question, Sam? Yep.
Thank you. Sam Chase with Metro Council. It's really an honor to have all of you in one panel. I appreciate you putting this on and doing this work. Most of us are familiar with the old adage that history is the best predictor of the future. I'm wondering if that applies here, and you could talk a little bit about what you think a panel 30 years from now might be saying about our history and what our biggest successes or maybe failures were.
Well, so keep in mind that this is one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in North America. There's a record of human habitation here that goes back 12,000 years. And people have been kind of responding to the opportunities of this landscape in a variety of ways for a very long time. So 30 years is like, you know, basically the blink of an eye in the human experience of living in this region. And looking at these flags around us and kind of the fact that we're in the Native American Student Center at Portland State University, you know, reminds us, I think, that there's a tremendous wealth of human experience here that we're just beginning to kind of understand. And I think one of the things that that suggests to me, and I'll let others respond to this as well, is that there's a ton of inertia in this landscape. Even with climate change, even with changes in the economy, even with changes in taste, you know, it wasn't that long ago that the idea that people would be interested in a center city housing market was, you know, kind of, you know, we couldn't sell it, right? It was still all about the suburbs back in the 90s even, and the 80s. It was tough. But my overall sense is that this place will continue to send us some pretty strong messages about what it means to live in this place and in this landscape, and that will, in fact, in many ways, still profoundly shape our experience of this region. But Cy and Sheila, anything to add?
I hope we're still talking about these things 30 years from now. And the issues may be different as a result of the demographic and other shifts, climate change related stuff taking place. But I do think there is something to the notion that as a result of the laws and the institutions that have been around now for these several decades, that we have a community of planners broadly considered. And the notion of who's a planner, again, it's a very elastic definition. There are many people participating in the conversation, and we are struggling. And I think the key thing is to be explicit about what we are trying as a regional community, if we're focusing now on the Portland metropolitan area, to achieve. I think that's a really profound notion. And whenever we are explicit about what we hope to accomplish and what we think it's going to take to get from where we are to where we want to be, we will generate conflict. The very fact that we are explicit as a regional community about what we want to accomplish will generate conflict. Rather than each one of us is making an individual decision and we only see after the fact what it all seems to add up to. We say up front, this is what we'd like to accomplish, here's how we think we can get from here to there. That's planning, again, broadly conceived, and I do think it distinguishes the way we do stuff out here from most of the rest of the world, and I think that's a really very significant and valuable way of living.
Okay. One more?
Yeah.
Okay. Good luck in choosing. Yeah.
I want to join Sam, too. I'm Randy Miller in thanking you. This has been a very enlightening discussion. I want to comment, too, Sheila, on your remarks about uniqueness here and also tension between economic development and other elements of the issues in the area. That's kind of always existed here, but about 13 years ago, through Duncan Wise and the Oregon Business Council, the Oregon Business Plan was initiated to try to bring all the elements of public policy and economic development together by bringing the 4 major business organizations, plus now Greater Portland, Inc., which also you cited, which is doing a 5-year plan now, under the concept that they would join with the public sector in bringing the civic engagement, all the elements of what we need to do to achieve economic development while still preserving some of the issues around poverty, housing, transportation, land use together. And it's been so successful in terms of legislative impact in achieving the different goals that have brought all these together that it has been noticed around the country for its uniqueness and have the Oregon Business Council has been asked to provide speakers, and I've been the guy that have gone around the country to be able to discuss how we were able to do this. So it really does bring both those elements together of success here, which is unique and also has been very effective in terms of public policy.
Randy, I think I've been to every one except one of those Oregon Business Council meetings. I came before I even moved to Portland when I was still in Olympia. I came to the very first one. And since I've been to every one of them, I know what those meetings look like, and I would challenge you to ask the question about the diversity of voices that are participating in that conversation. Diversity? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, in fact, I'm going to be speaking next week at the meeting of the Poverty Initiative.
Yeah, great. Well, it sounds like there'll be plenty to talk about at that meeting.
Yeah.
That's great. That's terrific. Absolutely. Now, speaking of conflict, I want to say that there has been no conflict between the Oregon and Washington chapters of the American Planning Association in producing this book, and no rabbits were harmed. But I do want to say that in the audience is Jason Franklin, who's the director of campus planning here, and was also the president of the Oregon chapter at the time we did this book. And without the support of the Oregon and Washington chapters, we would not be able to give away these books right now as we were going to do. So thank you, Jason. So let's start with an easy one. Who's lived here less than 5 years? Okay, who's lived here less than 4 years? Less than 3 years? Oh, less than 3 years. We have a winner. Come on down. Yeah. That's great. Okay. I mean, really, absolutely, right? I mean, like, you know, come on up. This is for you. Welcome to the region. That's great. It'd be great if we could give one away with every driver's license. It'd be totally great. Okay, let's try something else. Who's lived here for 40 years? Who's lived here for 45 years? Who's lived here for 50 years? Who's lived here for 55 years? 60 years? 65 years? 70 years? Ooh, 68 years? 69 years? 68 years? 68 years and 6 months? 68 years and 9 months? All right. Come on down. I just hope no one ever accuses us of not being precise, you know? So thank you very much, Topaz. Enjoy it, read it, share it with a newcomer to the region. Okay, let's try this one. In 1980, 2 important plans were adopted in the metropolitan area. 1980, a really important year. It's 35 years ago. What were those 2 important plans? Susan Hartnett, what do you think? Portland Comprehensive Plan, okay. That's right. Okay. Nice try, though. Yeah. Okay. Another hand back there. Nope. That was 1972. No, that wasn't until 1996, basically 94, 96, depending on how you count it. Yeah. Nope. What do you mean the Metro Plan?
I mean the plan that Metro did to comply with SB 100.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. But it's pretty interesting, but sadly it's a little imprecise, I must say. So we know that one of them is the Portland Comprehensive Plan. Yeah. Yes, adoption of the urban growth boundary. Charles, come on down and get your book. Very close, Ann, I gotta say it, you know. Yeah, it was really tough. Okay, so the Minnesota Twins in the American League Central Division are currently in 2nd place. How many games out of 1st are they? 8? Nope. We're talking the Twins here. 20. Nope. No. Yeah, well, given the twins, right? Yeah, right. But how many? 12, you're right. Here you go. Yeah, yeah. All right. Fantastic. It's so great to have baseball fans here in the audience. We do hope that the rest of you will go to Amazon and buy it at a discount, or Planners Press. We really appreciate your being here today. Connie, you want to add any final closing thoughts?
No, I just want to thank you all again for coming. Thank the panelists, Sheila, Sai, Ethan. This is the beginning of a conversation. You guys should keep talking to us about what your thoughts are before you read the book, after you read the book, whatever. And we hope to see you here on November 4th. Have a good day.
Thanks.